So I think 5 minutes have passed since 5 p.m. And it is with very great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, that on behalf of the college, I welcome Jay Winter as this year's Lees Knowles Lecturer. Since 1915, the first such lecture, there have been 72 Lees Knowles lecturers, some of them very distinguished, 4 field marshals amongst them, but none, I think, more distinguished than Professor Winter, whom I have the pleasure of calling Jay, as I'll explain. I should, of course, said that I was welcoming Jay back to Cambridge. After all, he got his PhD here and was a fellow of Pembroke and taught history here for over 20 years and is general editor of the 3-volume Cambridge History of the Great War. So, welcome back, Jay. And it was only in 2001, not very long ago, that Jay left us to go to Yale, where he was the, I'll get this name right, Charles Stille Professor of History, from which he retired some 7 or more years ago. So ending a teaching career that started at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, went on to Warwick and Columbia before returning here. But none of these moves, of course, has stopped an extraordinary flow, a torrent of important research and writing. It would be impossible to list all Jay's books, so I will spare you that, not far off about 30, I think, at the last count. I don't think he calls himself a military historian, and these are military history lectures, but rather a cultural, demographic, and social historian of Europe's disastrous second 30 Years' War in the middle of the 20th century. He must, I think, also be about the only historian to have won an Emmy for his expertise in producing and writing a television series, the BBC series on the Great War in the 1990s. He's probably best known for his wonderful book, Sites of Memory, Sites of Mourning, about the terrifying and moving question of what to do with the armies of the dead after 1918, with heartrending struggles for commemoration between many bereaved villages, whether on the continent or in Britain's sad shires, struggles for commemoration between villages and what seemed to many their less feeling nations. I could go on, but I can't end without a personal word of thanks for 2 blessings. First, a secretary of the History Faculty Board, and I can't quite remember when, Jay saved my chairmanship, or kept it, roughly speaking, on the road. More importantly, you also introduced me to l'Historial de la Grande Guerre at Péronne, not far from the Somme. My wife and I visited it some years ago. Her father had won 2 military crosses in the Great War, and we found it a quite astonishingly moving experience. It is a most wonderful creation. So please, anybody who drives from Calais to Paris down the autoroute numéro 1, exit at, I think, exit 13, find yourself in Péronne, and when you've got there, say a word of thanks to Jay. Jay, welcome back.
Thank you, John. It's very kind words, and indeed it is a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Master and Fellows of Trinity for this invitation, and also say that in constructing the series of 4 lectures, I did so without being the slightest bit aware of how Putin would show the relevance of the subject of the civilianization of warfare to the historical community, and indeed to anyone who has a sense of the tragedy unfolding before our eyes, as more or less as I speak. The notion that civilians are targeted directly and become the central focus of the lethal weaponry of modern war was evident, and indeed, as many commentators talk about it 100 years ago. We talk about the parallel between the Spanish flu and COVID. That is an interesting and important subject, but there's another one. There's another killer event, which I think is unfolding now with the end of the story not at all clear. Now, before the invasion of Ukraine, there has been a change in the historiography of the First World War that I think frames what I'm trying to say here. The first move that I think was evident during the centenary is the shift of the center of gravity of the conflict east and global, away from Paris to Warsaw, away from London to Lviv, formerly Lemberg. And the second is the shift of the chronological limits of the war from 1914 outward to 1918 to 1923. And there is now, I think, a general consensus among historians of the First World War that the conflict beginning in 1914 came to an end on the 24th of July, 1923, in the Swiss city of Lausanne. And how that happened, how that peace treaty reflected the transformation of the institutions of war is the subject of the 4 lectures that I shall proceed on Wednesdays to give. You can see the 4 of them are about how it happened. How did the warfare of 1918 to 1923 end in the peace treaty of Lausanne, ending the decade of violence that began in 1914. Some people actually think it should go back to 1912 in the Balkan Wars, and there's some force in that argument. And the 4 lectures will be on the subject. I draw from a wonderful book called The Bridge at Saint Louis Ray that I read many, many years ago to talk about the various layered passages from war to peace, which enable me to speak about the responsibilities for what I want to make clear, I believe, was one of the worst peace treaties of the 20th century. And I'll try to explain why I've reached that conclusion this week and in subsequent weeks. We start today at Geneva, just near Lausanne, not far, an hour's train ride, 45 minutes. And the reason is that I think the formulation of the peace treaty was the result of a series of decisions taken in Geneva at the League of Nations. I'll try to explain why I think so later. Now, what caused the peace treaty of 1923 to take the form that it did? The first is that there were mutations of both war and peace in the years after the Armistice of 1918. The premise of these 4 lectures is, as warfare changes, so does peace. And I think one of the interesting features of the development of military history as a discipline is the unfortunate divide between those who study peace and those who study war, as if they aren't part of the same landscape of violence and power. Now, the first of the features or the first of the central points, as I said, of my lectures is that war actually bleeds into peace. They aren't separate. The Great War did not end, as most textbooks and indeed most narratives believe, on the 11th of November with the armistice on the Western Front, nor did it stop on the 28th of June, 1919, with the signature of the Paris Peace Treaty. Instead, in 1917 and 1918, that coherence of the First World War was smashed by the Russian Revolution and a sequel of violent aftershocks of that revolution. The reason why I suggest that war bled into peace is that the First World War after the Russian Revolution fragmented into a series of decentered wars, which between 1918 and 1923 devastated large parts of Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe. The Russian Revolution wasn't the only reason for that, but it is one of them. The nature of this new cluster of wars differed from that of 1914-18, which I still believe was essentially a war of imperial powers fought to determine imperial hegemony. both in Europe and in the world. I still believe that to a degree, the First World War was a war between Germany and Britain for control of northwestern Europe. That's what the imperial war was about. And indeed, that Britain, France, and their allies won that war. The problem, though, was that the collapsing empires, as Robert Gervart had showed, fragmented in many different ways, not only politically, militarily, but also socially and culturally. After 1918, a new kind of decentered warfare emerged, based at times on state power, but at other times on the contest between regional, ethnic, and confessional groups in some areas, and simultaneous class conflicts in these and in other areas. War became revolution, and revolution became war. There is a school of thought, and here I do not speak as a Russian specialist, I wish I were, to say that the war that began in 1914 has never ended in Russia. There are those who see that maybe it ended in 1991, but maybe we need to qualify that argument today. Now, the decentering of warfare marked the aftermath in another way. The collapse of empires, mixed with the commitment of the Allies under US-American pressure to the principle of self-determination, produced what historian Erez Manela called the Wilsonian moment. What mattered most, he argued, was not what Wilson said, but what colonized people all over the world made of what he said. Wilson's language provided legitimacy to many movements that were developing entirely independently of European liberalism or American liberalism, for that matter. Self-determination was a phrase offering respectability to policies and ideas that emerged on their own long before the Great War. There were many other sources to the surge of anti-colonial sentiment at the end of the Great War than Wilsonianism. Subject peoples didn't need the instruction of the president of Princeton University about the injuries of empire. Now, and yet Wilsonian rhetoric added force to the pleas of those in many parts of the world who believed that it was time violently to oppose the perpetuation of the imperial system. There were peaceful protests at the same moment as there were violent ones. The contrast I urge you to look at is Ireland and Korea. Whereas Henrik Kwan has shown recently, the fundamental first steps towards freedom were peaceful steps, repressed violently, but nonetheless steps taken peacefully. Ireland has many, shall we say, features of the Civil War, but peaceful protest is, shall we say, a less significant part of the story than violent ones. Now, the onset of economic depression from 1920 on affected imperial countries more than non-imperial countries, and the cost of paying war pensions turned declining returns on international trade into annual budget crises in the imperial countries of Britain and France. Why does this matter? It matters because the great imperial powers increased their holdings, their imperial and non-imperial holdings, at precisely the moment that they could no longer afford to run them militarily. And this presented the backdrop for the negotiations over the Lausanne Treaty of 1923. This is the context of the war-related flaring up of anti-colonial movements throughout the world, started in Korea, demonstrations against the Japanese Empire, as I said. There were those in Amritsar in India, where the massacre of demonstrators at Jallian Balawag dissolved lingering imperial sentiment in India. In China, enraged students burned down the telegraph offices where they received word that the Western powers had decided that the province of Shandong, Confucius's birthplace, would be in the hands of the Japanese, at least temporarily. In short, a series of anti-colonial protests disturbed the peace that had supposedly broken out on 11 November 1918. Now, if anybody mistook these developments as remote from Europe, they could look, as I said, to many different countries. Among them is a very understudied war in Morocco, the Rif Rebellion, which continued until 1928. There is a very violent story to be told about Egypt as well, from 1918 to 22, and the rumblings of the century-long conflict in Palestine could be measured as part of this story too. Uprisings, unrest, insurrection, civil war, class conflict, and ethnic violence reached a level after 1918 not registered in the first years of the First World War. Once states and empires were delegitimized, either by being unable to deliver victory or to feed their people, the monopoly Central Forces held over the lawful use of physical force collapsed. In its place came competing groups asserting their authority through violence, both expressive and instrumental, both symbolic of their claims and effective in destroying those who challenged them. In a series of moving lectures on sciences of vocation and politics of vocation, Max Weber drew this conclusion, that the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force was no longer in the hands of central authorities. It was broken and dispersed. Now, one example illustrates a general trend towards intercommunal violence. Before the Armistice, I want you to take a look at this image. Before the Armistice, before the 11th of November 1918, there had been no major anti-Semitic violence in the Habsburg city of Lemberg, or Lvov, as it was named in Polish. It was under fire yesterday, I believe, by Putin's forces. In the first week of peace, though, literally in the first week, on the 18th to the 26th of November, during fighting between Polish and Ukrainian units for the control of the city, about 150 Jews were killed and 500 injured in this center of Jewish culture. That had not happened between 1914, either under Russian occupation or under Austrian rule. One of the city's prominent synagogues, this is a Hasidic synagogue, was completely gutted. This is the remains after the burning to the ground. And the people responsible, absolutely explicit, were Polish militiamen, not Ukrainian, for these outrages, blaming Jews for an alliance with Ukrainian forces, which is patently absurd. Nonetheless, the accusations took on a certain kind of toxic anti-Semitism that we know, merged with anti-Bolshevik feeling into a wave of anti-Semitism in 1919 in Ukraine. The latest estimate that I have is that there were 1,500 pogroms, 1,500 attacks on Jewish communities in 1919 in Ukraine alone. Until this war, until now, this week, I don't think the Jewish people actually identified themselves as Ukrainian. It took Putin to make Jewish Ukrainians into Ukrainians. Now, clearly, the mutation of warfare made the business of peacemaking not only much more difficult, but entirely unstable. And one way to understand the history of 1918 to 1923 is as a series of efforts by the losers to tear up the treaties dictated to them by the winners. The first time this happened was at Lausanne in 1923. It would not be the last. Now, the second feature I want to draw your attention to in these 4 lectures is what I call the civilianization of war. The term is meant to capture the shift from wars directed primarily against enemy armies by central command to wars with or without command centers that primarily target civilians. Protecting people who do not take part in fighting was the explicit purpose of the Geneva Conventions and of the corpus of international humanitarian law it engendered, especially developed in Russia, but not only there. That protection, I believe, broke down during the First World War and collapsed completely after, in the years 1918 to 23. I can explain in questions later on if anyone wants to know, but the estimates that I've made is that the 11 million men who died in the First World War between 1914 and 18 were succeeded by a loss of life in the wars of 1918 to 23, higher still, between 12 and 13 million. Now, the important point is that the shock of 1914-18 was so great, and it's so centered on Western Europe, the imperial heartland of the war, that this second Great War has been obscured until now, until historians successfully shifted the center of gravity of the military history of the First World War east. It became clear until, and with necessarily that shift, only then could we see how lethal the period 1918 to 23 is. Anyone who wants to get a feel for the contrast I'm trying to make should read Dr. Zhivago. It seems to me that is the world that I'm talking about. Now, the Lvov pogrom showed what civilianization of war meant. By 1923, and this is the central form of my argument, I believe that a threshold had been passed. In other words, it wasn't one event or 2 events, but a series of events that took place between 1900 and 1923, 24, that can explain the civilianization of war. It's not one event, but multiple events that progressively eroded the protection that civilians had been afforded in the period before 1918. By 1923, a threshold had been passed. Violence against civilians in Europe and beyond became the norm. And how to distinguish between armed bands under recognizable authority and paramilitary groups or criminal bands was anybody's guess. In addition, the treatment of prisoners of war from Finland to Turkey became murderous in a way almost unknown between 1914 and 1918. I have never come across a document, in 50 years of working on 1418, about the torture of prisoners of war to gain information. I haven't found the documentation. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm simply telling you what my archival work has not yielded. Between 1919 and 23, partly because of the creation of the Soviet secret police, torture became a commonplace. Now, was this true in other parts of the world? I can't say. But what I can say is that the rules of engagement, which is at the core of the institution of war, the way in which war is waged, the rules of engagement expanded to include forms of violence that weren't evident before. The centering of war, decentering, meaning that there is no one center of control, created conditions necessitating the requisitioning of supplies in the field. This meant expropriation, robbing, killing, maiming, looting, or beating peasants and villagers, destroying their homes, seizing their animals, theft on the grand scale. But it also entailed the use of hunger as a way of asserting the authority over an insurgent group. Now, finding stability was almost impossible under conditions of economic chaos and epidemic disease. This is why I think the mortality of 1918 to 23 is so much higher than 14 to 18. What happens is that endemic disease was merged with epidemic disease in all of the great killers that had been more or less under control in Western Europe, but not in the East. One example is Greece and Macedonia, where the Balkan Wars of 1912 to 13 had chased off their land hundreds, thousands of farmers. Now, what did they leave behind? Archipelagos of stagnant pools of water, spawning the worst malaria epidemic in European history. For French soldiers, for British soldiers, by the way, in the Salonika campaign, malaria was the chief killer. In the Ukraine, it was dysentery, cholera, bubonic plague. All of these old killers were returned to ruin the lives of the population of these regions. Why did the set of decentered wars against civilians, come to an end? The first reason is the restoration of economic stability. The inflationary spiral of 1918 to 23 had made recovery virtually impossible, and it took a multinational effort to stabilize both the German and other currencies. You should recall that the worst year of economic instability, probably in the 20th century, was 1923. There are many stories about people going to have a cup of coffee and paying twice as much in Deutschmarks or whatever marks there were for their coffee. But I think the other point is that Western powers finally recognized the Bolshevik regime, and with Lenin's death in 1924, the revolutionary danger appeared to subside. Finally, and maybe this is an unknown and not unknown, but it needs more emphasis, sheer exhaustion diminished the capacity of warring groups to carry on the struggle. Now, in 1924, Europe had become once again a coherent and perhaps not coherent, but a continent of legitimate nation states. But the stability of those states was compromised both by the ravages of interstate wars as well as by conflicts among a wide array of warring groups regularly targeting non-combatants. What happened in Turkey and Anatolia between 1919 and 22 was both a war between armies and a war against innocent villagers. The Turkish figures on the number of civilians who died is 4 times greater than the number of soldiers who perished in direct conflict with the invading Greek armies. The problem is that on both sides, innocent villagers were targeted, and a sequel of tit-for-tat massacres are part of the story, but not the only one, because the same thing happened in a huge arc of violence extending from Helsinki to Baku. The point I made about prisoners of war, for instance, twice as many soldiers died in the period after the end of the Civil War in prisoner of war camps than during the fighting itself in Finland. This is, by the way, a war that is still very, very sensitive to discuss in Helsinki to this day. And the reason was, this is the precedent that Francisco Franco followed in the 1930s and 40s, of killing more people after the end of the war than during it. Let me try to say that the civilianization of war left enduring traces in one place that I want to refer to particularly, that is in Lausanne and in the treaty signed on the 24th of July, 1923. Let me see if I can summarize my argument for these 4 weeks. The Treaty of Lausanne marked a threshold separating a period when war against civilians was part of military conflict. I won't say a legitimate part, but a recognized part of legitimate conflict. Maybe not its defining feature, but one with which we have to live. I would suggest that, if you will, from 1923 on, war against civilians has become the norm of warfare, not the exception. This is a threshold argument. It's not an argument about a particular day or a particular battle, but about a form of violence which became so generalized against civilians that it could not indeed be stopped. I do, and this is something that I've felt for a long time, it's for this reason that I think the First World War and its aftermath in 1923 was the antechamber of the Holocaust. That it prepared, if you will, the intellectual, or if you will, the imaginative grounds for the disappearance of millions of civilians who died in conflict that had no sense of protection, but conflict in which they were targeted. Now, why does the Treaty of Lausanne, which will, I think, be feted by the Turkish Republic and probably by others, I'm not sure about the Greek government, we shall see about that. Why should the Treaty of Lausanne be treated, as my dear departed friend Zara Steiner said, as a victory, as a success? I disagree with her, and I want to present a different point of view. A century ago, almost to the day, after the complete defeat of Greek forces in Anatolia in the summer of 1922, everyone agreed that it was time to make peace. That termination of hostilities was the purpose of the Treaty of Lausanne. In these lectures, I want to tell the story of that peace conference and the approach a number of national delegations. I would need 8 or 9 lectures to tell the full story of Lausanne. I have 4, and I will try to do my best to tell the national stories. The imperial side of the story will have to wait. In this first lecture, I want to tell one part of the tale. I follow the story of the drafting and adoption of what became Section 6 of the Treaty of Lausanne, a convention respecting the exchange of Greek and Turkish civilians, that is to say, Greek and Turkish populations, not soldiers, and protocol signed on the 30th of January, 1923. It is the only such document in the history of the 20th century. There have been many voluntary population exchange agreements. This is the only compulsory one in international law. Of course, there have been compulsory population exchanges done by force and indeed reinforced by governments in different ways. This is the only one that is an essential part of a peace treaty. Now, that 6th convention, in my view, is my smoking gun. That is why I've entitled these lectures, The Civilianization of War. The Treaty of Lausanne set up as one of the conditions of peace the unmixing, that's the phrase used at the time, of populations. The term unmixing was introduced into the proceedings by Fridtjof Nansen, the celebrated Norwegian explorer and League of Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, in his written and his oral presentation to the delegates attending the peace conference on the 1st of December, 1922. Today, we use a sanitary metaphor for the forced expulsion of peoples. Now the term is ethnic cleansing, as if the removal of people of a particular origin, ethnicity, or race from a mixed community renders that community purer, cleaner, healthier, less susceptible to friction and conflict. Dirt, as anthropologist Mary Douglas put it, is a matter out of place. Unmixing, or ethnic cleansing, is the removal of people out of place. What made the new language of expulsion particularly striking was that at Lausanne, nationality, and thereby citizenship, was defined solely by religion, not at all by language, by custom, or personal choice. In the Lausanne Treaty, the term Greeks meant Christians and not Muslims. And the term Turks meant Muslims and not Christians. From the time of the Treaty of Lausanne, and with certain exceptions, Greek Orthodox Christians living in Anatolia, as they had done for centuries, were out of place in the new Turkey, the winner of the Greek-Turkish War, the last spasm of the First World War. Muslim citizens of Greece, the losers in the war, were out of place in towns and villages in which they and their ancestors had lived as well for a long period of time, some of them for not very long. Ataturk was actually born in Salonika, which became Greek only after the Balkan Wars. But he was a Salonika boy, as it were. What made this unmixing particularly brutal was that it was compulsory. It was enforced by violence. In 1913, again in 1919, Greece and Bulgaria voluntarily exchanged populations. But this was a recognition of the time-honored tendency of civilians to flee conflict zones voluntarily, as my parents did when they left Poland or Russia, in Byelorussia probably, before the First World War. After the First World War, civilians were frequently trapped in areas in which fighting occurred and during which non-combatants were targeted. In 1923, and for the first time, to end this kind of war, population exchange became compulsory. The civilianization of war meant that civilian ethnic cleansing became an integral, indeed a central part of the peace accord. At Lausanne, civilian populations in the millions were hostages exchanged in the interests of peace. With the exception of Constantinople and the islands of Imbros and Tenedos, where Greeks could stay, Greeks in inverted commas, and in Western Thrace, where Muslims could stay, everybody else in the newborn Turkish Republic and in Greece had to be unmixed, whether they liked it or not. The result was a population exchange of over 1 million Christians and up to 500,000 Muslims. These people, as well as those who had already fled before 1923, lost their citizenship. This is, I think, one of the central examples proving the point that Hannah Arendt made in The Origins of Totalitarianism. This research that I've done has persuaded me that her book is partly a reflection on her own position of statelessness, but also on that of so many others earlier than the arrival of the Nazis in 1923. And the point is that in 1923, compulsory expulsion was dignified by the force of law. Some contemporaries saw this as a life-saving measure, and maybe it was. The humanitarian leader Nansen, to whom I shall return in a moment, submitted a proposal of this kind to the delegates at Lausanne 10 weeks after the cosmopolitan city of Smyrna, now Izmir, had been destroyed by fire in early September 1923. There, unmixing meant murder, rape, and pillage. Everybody knew of the plight of the victims of this event and of hundreds of thousands of others living in what had become a war zone. To Nansen, extreme measures were justified to prevent a mass slaughter or the slow death by starvation and disease of civilians fleeing the conflict. The forcible removal of civilians, in his view, was a humanitarian act, essential to the securing of the true pacification, that's his phrase, of the region and indeed of Europe as a whole. The leaders of the Greek and Turkish delegations at Lausanne, Eleftherios Venizelos and Mustafa İsmet, concurred, and with a mixture of distaste and resignation by Lord Curzon, who indeed had his own experience of population exchange in India in mind, the civilianization of war was agreed. It became a principle, indeed an essential part of the fashioning of peace. Of course, there were older elements in the peace conference at Lausanne, not just these. It was a conventional assembly of sovereign states, both the winners and the losers, seeking an end to a state of war. But I do believe that it broke new ground. That groundbreaking moment was on the 1st of December 1922, when the delegates took up the question of population exchange. Now, in later lectures, I'm going to chart the history of war and peace in terms of how Lausanne shaped the national aspirations of Turkey, Greece, and Armenia. That is all I have time for. The first two were at Lausanne, not only as enemies in the 1418 war, but as the adversaries of the war of 1919 to 22, won by Turkey. That victory had buried the stillborn Sèvres Treaty of August 1920, and in its place, both belligerents came to Lausanne to redefine their boundaries and their national existence. But a third nation was on the sidelines, though her destiny was an integral part of the story. Armenia was not a full participant in the peace conference. I'll try to explain why, but sent observers to it. Armenia deserves a lecture on its own, even though it was excluded from the proceedings. Like Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference of 1938, Armenia's fate was decided by other countries, even though an Armenian delegation was there. The silent pressure of the Armenian people and of the victims of the genocide that had begun in 1915 was a defining feature of the peace conference at Lausanne that ended a decade of war. Now, let's return to Lausanne, and I'll tell you a bit more what happened when Nansen showed up on the 1st of December. At 3:30 p.m. precisely, Lord Curzon, who was chairman of the Territorial and Military Commission, called to order its 8th meeting. He said that he had convened the commission that afternoon in order to discuss a question of immediate importance arising directly out of the exchange of prisoners of war, namely the exchange of populations between Turkish and Greek territory. Do you see the elision? Wars until 1923 always involved an exchange of prisoners of war. It's happening in Ukraine as well. But the way Curzon put it was new. He talked about alongside an exchange of prisoners, namely the exchange of populations between Turkish and Greek territory. Now, why was Nansen there at all? Explorer, scientist, writer, athlete, statesman, who won the Nobel Peace Prize that very year. He had prepared a speech to answer that question, was distributed and read out to the delegates in French, but he wasn't a delegate, and the League of Nations was not responsible for these operations. He was there, he said, to deal with a humanitarian disaster. This is how he saw his mission, and I quote, "I am very happy to have been able to accept the invitation conveyed to me by Lord Curzon to address this commission of the Peace Conference on the subject of the proposed exchange of the Greek and Turkish minorities in their respective countries. It is a matter which I have been able, during the last 2 months, to give a great deal of attention and one which I venture to think deserves the consideration and the immediate and earnest consideration of the delegates gathered in Lausanne today. It is a matter which, after the investigations I have been privileged to make, I believe to be, and I speak advisedly, of real importance to the peace and economic stability of the Near East. It may perhaps be right for me to explain in a few words why I have devoted some time to the study of the proposed exchange of populations, and why I felt it my duty to make a report on the subject to the governments of the members of the League of Nations. Having been charged by the Assembly of the League with work for the hundreds of thousands of refugees who, as a result of the recent war, had left their homes in the Near East, I proceeded at the beginning of October to Constantinople in Greece. While I was engaged in investigating refugee problems there, I was privileged to enter into relations with the authorities, both of the Turkish and Greek governments, and to bring some small relief with the funds placed at my disposal by the members of the League to the starving refugees of both nationalities," unquote. With the support of the governments, Nansen drew up his proposal for an exchange of minority populations in Greece and Turkey and traveled directly from Constantinople to Lausanne to make sure that the delegates addressed it as the cornerstone of the peace treaty. Nansen told the delegates, quote, "To unmix the populations of the Near East will tend to secure the true pacification of the region," unquote. This measure was, he believed, the quickest and most efficacious way of dealing with the grave economic results which must result from the great movement of population which has already occurred. What he had seen on his visit to Constantinople added to the urgency of his mission. "I do not pretend that the question is not full of grave difficulties. Anyone who has reflected upon what is involved in the displacement of populations of more than 1 million people, in uprooting these people from their homes, transferring them to a strange new country, registering, valuing, liquidating their individual property, which they abandon, and in securing to them the payment of their just claims to the value of this property, will understand that the difficulties are immense." The implementation of such a measure was feasible, he claimed, and though fraught with difficulties, it represented a way out of a looming catastrophe. Nansen wanted, quote, to impress upon this commission the gravity of the economic situation of the Near East. There have already been very great displacements of population. More than 1 million people have left their homes and flocked into the territories of another. They have left their productive employment in Turkey or without any possibility of securing other productive employment in Greece. This is a grave matter, and I think it is not too much to say that unless something is done, and done now, to deal with it, the economic result for both countries, and these remarks apply, in my view, with as much force to Turkey as to Greece, will be disastrous. More can be done by a prompt and efficient exchange of minority populations to prevent disastrous economic results from coming about than by any other measure. In carrying out such a mission, League of Nations experts could play an essential role, one in which the Turkish people, Nansen said, could have full confidence. Now, he had worked with the Soviet authorities without necessarily being a Soviet supporter. He presented himself as a middleman, an honest broker who could save the lives of people distressed and displaced by war. And everybody, of course, knew about Nansen. He was a world historical figure at the time. It's hard to make an equivalent claim who would be the Nansen of today. But it is certainly true that when he spoke to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, he spoke about the suffering people of Europe, and he came to Lausanne to speak for them. Now, the political cartoonist, this is one of the most extraordinary political cartoons I've ever seen. This is Fridtjof Nansen feeding the penguins. And it was a political cartoon drawn during the Treaty of Lausanne. The cartoonist, a man named, he's a Hungarian named Emeritus, saw Nansen make his entry into the conference. And Kellen himself, who developed a certain kind of what I would call diplomatic political cartoon, alongside another Hungarian artist called Alois Deren. And the two of them together proceeded to sell to whoever would want them more than 100 political cartoons. And the one that is, I think, the bestseller of them all is this one, of Nansen. Why? Why is it that he was, as it were, seen as a benefactor, as if the civilian populations of Greece and Turkey were penguins? It's a difficult matter to resolve, and yet it showed something about the unusual nature of his presence in the court in this international event. Now, he was an international figure, Nansen, at home in many different worlds. Age 61 in 1922, he was a celebrated zoologist, oceanographer, sportsman, explorer, writer, and diplomat. He went to Washington during the war on behalf of the Norwegian government to help secure food supplies for his country. In 1920, he was named one of the 3-man Norwegian delegation to the League. He had worked at Geneva, and he was part of a remarkable group of international civil servants engaged in launching a multifaceted campaign on behalf of the civilian victims of war. The first such measures, as I've already suggested, were epidemiological and medical in character. One of the early parts of the League was that. The second was military and political, and focused on the effort to liberate prisoners of war still incarcerated in disease-ridden encampments in Russia and elsewhere, many years after the Armistice. Same thing that happened after the Second World War happened after the First. And these people who had been prisoners of war were accompanied by another large flight of civilians from Russia, of people who refused to live under the Bolshevik regime. Now, these populations fleeing the new regime, violence and disease, had no papers because the Soviets refused to give them. And this is why Nansen developed a series of measures leading to passports, which would have international recognition known to this day as Nansen passports. The fourth of his, as it were, achievements in the course of this period is the population exchange at the Lausanne Conference. Now, these efforts were initiated to help victims of the process I term the civilianization of war. He was the doctor, he said, to deal with the wounds of civilians who were trapped in war. Of course, the League of Nations officials took it as given that epidemic mortality respected no boundaries. Over time, they came to see that they, alongside other private and public agencies, had to do everything they could to contain a wave of mortality attributable to infectious diseases which, if unchecked, threatened the reconstruction of Europe as a whole. Now, these humanitarian efforts were the background for the Lausanne population exchange. From the outset, Nansen argued that the emergency ruled out a voluntary agreement. It simply wouldn't happen. You know, there were people who were living in Cappadocia and in certain rural parts of Turkey who had no idea that the war had happened. And yet they had to leave. They had literally to move out of their villages because the population exchange said that they were incapable of maintaining their citizenship in Turkey. The only way to save as many people as possible, he believed, was to make the exchange compulsory. But what made this compulsory exchange so problematic was that it was entirely defined by religion, and by religion alone. Here is a controversial idea, to which I think others returned later on. Suffice it to say that Nansen believed that after the atrocities of the previous 7 years, Greek Orthodox residents of Turkey could not remain there because of their religion, and the same applied to Muslim residents of Greece. Before the treaty was concluded, there would be parallel exceptions to the rule. Indeed, there was for a time, Nansen thought that the entire Greek Orthodox population of Constantinople would have to leave as well, but they were left out of this agreement. The mixed legacy of Nansen's contribution to the Treaty of Lausanne should not obscure the positive outcome of his initiative. He did save lives. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Nansen was an advocate for those whose lives had been disfigured by war and revolution, but his solution had a savage side to it, like surgery without anesthesia. His clients survived, but at a terrible price, and this is what Hannah Arendt describes in The Origins of Totalitarianism. Human rights did not exist. National sovereignty of ethnically defined states eliminated human rights from the discussion completely. Nansen, left a very clear record. He'd had negotiations in Constantinople and in Ankara. He understood that Mustafa Kemal would accept only a compulsory agreement of exchange. And Kemal cleverly avoided meeting Nansen, so there would have to be Nansen who made the proposal, not anyone from the Turkish side. The same thing was true, by the way, for Venizelos and the Greek side. They had understood that an ethnically, shall we say, less divided population of Greece would be a more stable state. But they couldn't say it aloud. They allowed the League of Nations to say the unsayable, that ethnic cleansing was a way of stabilizing the two states of Greece and Turkey after war that the Greek side lost. Now, Nansen physically saw the refugees all around Constantinople, and we have to understand that he watched as endless streams of miserable people, hungry and terrified, filed west to an uncertain future away from Anatolia. His aide-de-camp, Philip Noel Baker, feared that these people were ripe for mobilization by communist militants. It's one of the arguments that Nansen used, that hungry people will become communists. And therefore, it is in the interests of the imperial powers to make sure that they had a future in which they could become productive farmers. Now, Noel Baker is really a fascinating figure, gifted athlete, son of a Canadian Quaker who had emigrated to Britain. He had a Quaker education, I think it was Bootham School in York, before a first in economics at King's. Noel Baker was part of the British Olympic team at the 1912 Olympic Games and won the silver medal in the 1,500-meter event at the 1920 Games. During the war, he was a conscientious objector and served at the front in an ambulance unit with distinction. I think he is the only man who won first an Olympic medal and later the Nobel Peace Prize. He was a partner and in some respects a very close friend of Nansen. And both were social engineers who developed a really quite, I would say, novel idea. The idea is that you send hungry people to places where they could grow their own food rather than to bring food to the hungry. The place to send them, the Turkish Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox people living in Turkey, is to Greece. Where would they be able to find homes? In part in new settlement in Macedonia, and part in the vacated houses of the Muslim expellees. One reason for the joint population exchange was to make it possible for the Greek Orthodox population of Anatolia to start farming again within the year. That was the idea. And Nansen ensured that through the League of Nations, there would be a loan, £12 million brokered by the Bank of England for the funds needed to build new communities and new farms in Greece. Now, framing the population agreement was Nansen's contribution to peacemaking. Once tabled, the agreement was ironed out, and it was signed. Here's the signing ceremony. On the left is Mustafa İsmet, who later became İnönü, the second president of Turkey. He is a man with his hand on his chin. To the right with the cap is Venizelos. This is the moment of their signature. That achievement enabled the negotiations to survive a break in the talks on 4 February, which I'll talk about next week, when the Turkish delegation refused to sign a draft treaty. But it was merely an interruption. In late April, the peace conference reconvened and worked out the details of the many thorny issues on which the two sides were at odds. 24th of July, 1923, the treaty was signed. This is when it was agreed, on the 30th of January, 1923. Now, what I wanted to do today was to examine how the peace conference resolved this most difficult issue. Next week, we turn to the principles at war. We start with Turkey, before turning to Greece in Lecture 3, and then finally discuss the Armenian tragedy, and show how it illustrated viscerally the ways in which the delegates at Lausanne closed their eyes to the Armenian genocide and to Armenian demands for a homeland in Anatolia. That transnational act of blindness was also built into the peace treaty. Now, if any people bore the scars of the civilization of war, it was the Armenian people. And yet, they were not the only people to suffer from the ramifications of Lausanne. At the end of this, the first Lees Knowles Lecture, I would like to ask you to reflect on the implications of this story for the world we live in today. As I said, I'm not an expert on Russian or Ukrainian history, but I believe that Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine, just as much as his war in Syria, are brutal instances of the civilization of war. Their origin may have been different, but their character and their outcome are similar. Lausanne was not so much a break with the past, but more a sign that a threshold had been passed in the first quarter of the 20th century, changing the institutions of war. Lausanne showed that as war changed, so did peace. This is the reason I would like to close by adding my voice to that of historian Bruce Clark. Now, he said, we are all the children of Lausanne. In the 3 lectures to come, I will try to show you why this is so. Thank you very much.